A woman in her early 60s recently described a situation that is hard to ignore. She stepped away from work to take care of her aging parents. That meant losing her income. And in the same moment, she lost her access to affordable health coverage. The plan available to her on the open market ran about $470 a month. With no paycheck coming in, she couldn't pay it. So she went without. And here's the part that matters most. That situation is not unusual anymore. Recent data from the Federal Reserve shows that only about 35% of Americans who have not yet retired feel that their retirement savings are actually on track. At the same time, only around 63% of adults say they could handle an unexpected $400 expense without borrowing money or selling something. Think about that number for a moment. More than a third of adults in the wealthiest country in the world cannot absorb a $400 surprise without going into debt or liquidating something. So this is not a conversation about people who failed to plan. It is a conversation about a system that is producing these outcomes at scale. Housing, food, insurance, healthcare. Almost every major expense category has moved faster than income for a significant portion of American households over the past decade. And when you look at the full picture, the question shifts. It is no longer just about why people are struggling to retire. It is about whether the system they were told to rely on still functions the way they were promised it would. Part 1. The where did we go wrong problem. There is a question that comes up constantly when people talk about retirement in America right now. A couple in their mid-50s both worked their entire adult lives, raised kids, paid their bills, stayed out of serious financial trouble, and they are still living paycheck to paycheck with almost nothing set aside for later. Their question is simple: where did we go wrong? The uncomfortable answer is that for a lot of people, they probably did not go wrong in any obvious way. The data supports that. According to estimates from studies including Transamerica's retirement research, the median retirement savings for people in their late 40s to mid-50s sits at around $100,000. That is the median, meaning half of people in that age range have less than that saved. Now, stretch that figure across 20 or 30 years of retirement, factor in inflation and healthcare costs, and even without a major emergency, it does not go very far. The standard response to this is, you should have started saving earlier. And technically, that is accurate, but it assumes there was money available to save in the first place. For a lot of households, especially over the past decade, that margin has been shrinking. Wages have grown, but not at the same pace as major expenses. Housing alone has consumed a larger share of income across most of the country. Add in childcare, healthcare, insurance, and basic living costs, and the idea of consistently setting aside money for 30 or 40 years becomes significantly harder in practice than it sounds on paper. This is where the conversation shifts from personal responsibility to structural reality, not in a dramatic way, just in a practical, mathematical sense. The numbers that used to make retirement work for an average household are not producing the same results anymore. People feel like they followed the rules, but the outcome does not match what they were expecting. Once you reach that point, the next question is not about saving more. It is about whether the target itself has moved. Part 2. Healthcare is the hidden catastrophe. When most people imagine retirement, they think about time, free time, travel, slowing down, doing things that work prevents. That image has been largely replaced by a much simpler and much more urgent concern. Can you afford to stay alive without going broke? Healthcare is where this pressure shows up most directly. According to estimates from Fidelity, a typical couple retiring today may need around $170,000 just to cover healthcare costs throughout retirement. That number does not include long-term care. Long-term care is a separate financial category entirely, and one that most people are dangerously underprepared for. Medicare helps, but it does not cover most long-term care services, extended nursing support, assisted living facilities, in-home care for people who can no longer fully care for themselves. Those costs fall directly on individuals, and they are not small. A private room in a nursing home now runs well over $100,000 per year in many parts of the country. Even assisted living or part-time in-home care can reach tens of thousands of dollars annually. These are not rare or extreme scenarios. They are the ordinary trajectory of aging for a significant portion of people. So, when someone says they are afraid to retire, it is not always about the slow drain of living expenses year after year. It is about what happens if something goes wrong quickly. One fall, one diagnosis. One event that changes the physical situation and suddenly requires a level of care that was never budgeted for. That is enough to completely restructure someone's financial picture, and it can happen faster than any savings plan anticipates. This is why the earlier example matters so much. A person in their 60s, no longer working, facing nearly $500 a month just to maintain basic health coverage before any actual medical need arises. You can budget for groceries. You can adjust your lifestyle. You can reduce discretionary spending. But you cannot reliably predict when healthcare costs will hit or how severe they will be when they do. That uncertainty turns retirement from a stable phase of life into something that feels like a sustained risk exposure. And when you combine that uncertainty with the reality that most people do not have large savings reserves, the whole idea of retirement becomes harder to trust. Part 3. The savings math doesn't work for most people. At some point, every conversation about retirement comes back to one piece of advice: save more. And in the abstract, that is correct. Save early, invest consistently, let compound growth work over decades. The math is real and it works under specific conditions. The problem is what those conditions actually require. Some estimates suggest that younger generations may need somewhere between $3 million and $4 million to retire comfortably at today's cost of living standards. The exact figure varies depending on assumptions about inflation, healthcare costs, and lifespan, but even at the lower end of that range, it is far beyond what most households are currently on track to reach. The Federal Reserve data confirms this. 65% of non-retired adults already feel behind on retirement savings. That is not a small group struggling at the margins. That is the majority. And then there is the question of financial resilience. If around a third of adults would struggle to cover a $400 emergency without borrowing, the foundational premise of long-term savings starts to break down. Long-term savings requires a surplus money left over after current needs are covered, consistently, year after year. That requires stable income, predictable expenses, and the ability to absorb setbacks without going backward. For a large portion of households, that combination is not reliably present. Real life does not follow the pattern that financial planning assumes. People lose jobs, medical bills appear unexpectedly, costs increase in categories that are difficult to reduce, a car that needs replacing, a roof that needs repair, a family member who needs financial support. Each of these disruptions pushes savings plans off track. And crucially, catching up becomes harder over time, not just because the math gets more demanding, but because the margin for recovery tends to shrink as people get older. This is why the gap between what people are told to do and what they can realistically do keeps widening. It is not a knowledge problem. Most people understand that they should be saving for retirement. It is a capacity problem, a structural limit on how much room there is in most household budgets to do what the advice says to do. And when enough people run into the same structural limit, it stops looking like individual failure and starts looking like something embedded in how the system is set up. Debate that goes nowhere. Whenever this topic comes up, it quickly becomes a generational debate. One side argues that people simply do not manage money the way they used to, less saving, more spending. The other side responds that the numbers have fundamentally changed and spending habits cannot explain the scale of the gap. Both contain real truth. And that is exactly why the debate never reaches any useful conclusion. It is true that older generations often lived differently in certain ways, more conservative in discretionary spending, more likely to repair things than replace them, more willing to delay purchases. That kind of behavior does compound meaningfully over time, but it is also true that the financial environment those generations operated in was structurally different. Housing is the clearest example. The median home price in the United States has moved above $400,000. First-time homebuyers now represent only about 21% of purchases, one of the lowest shares on record. For younger people trying to build the kind of asset base that previous generations used as a foundation for long-term financial security, the entry point is simply higher than it was. That is not a matter of priorities or discipline, it is arithmetic. And it is not only younger people facing this. Research from Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies shows that approximately 1/3 of older households are considered cost-burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Older generations may have benefited from lower entry costs earlier in life, but many are dealing with rising fixed expenses now, including in retirement. So the generational comparison tends to produce heat without light. Each group is navigating genuinely different economic conditions, and holding one experience up as the standard for judging the other misses most of what is actually happening. Part 5. When people stop working within the system. When people feel that a system is not delivering on its promises, they usually go through a predictable sequence. First, they try to optimize, spend less, work more, save harder. Then they start questioning whether the effort is worth it. And eventually, some of them stop trying to work within the system and start looking for ways around it. That shift is becoming more visible. You increasingly see people openly saying they are not saving for retirement at all, not because they do not understand the risk, but because they have lost confidence that the outcome will justify the sacrifice. If the finish line feels uncertain, the motivation to run toward it fades. The logic is not irrational. It is a response to diminished trust in a particular long-term arrangement. Others take a different approach. They focus entirely on the present, spend what they earn, prioritize experiences over long-term accumulation. The reasoning is that if the future is inherently unpredictable, it makes more sense to extract value from what is available now. That is not laziness. It is a specific response to uncertainty. Then there are people who attempt to step outside the conventional system more completely, moving to areas with lower costs, buying land, reducing dependence on traditional employment and consumption structures. On the surface, it looks like independence, but most of these approaches still interact with the existing system in significant ways. Property taxes, regulations, and basic cost structures do not disappear. So it is less a true exit and more a reorganization of how someone relates to the system. There is also a more contested version of this. Some people openly describe learning to rely on government support rather than traditional employment. That triggers strong reactions depending on who is observing. But regardless of how you evaluate it, what it signals is the same. When enough people start looking for exits and workarounds, confidence in the conventional path has eroded. None of these alternatives are stable, long-term solutions. Most come with their own forms of risk, but they are all signals pointing at the same underlying condition. Part 6. Retirement is no longer a clear exit. For a long time, retirement had a relatively clear shape. You work for a certain number of years, you accumulate savings, and eventually reach a point where you have enough. Then you step away and live on what you built. That transition is no longer as clean or as predictable as it used to be. Recent labor data shows that more than 11 million Americans aged 65 and older are currently in the workforce. That number has more than doubled compared to the mid-1990s. Some of that is voluntary people who remain engaged in work because they want to, but a significant portion is driven by financial necessity. People who expected to stop working have discovered that stopping does not feel financially safe. That changes what retirement actually means in practice. Instead of being a stable, settled phase, it becomes something closer to a continuous risk calculation. Am I far enough ahead to stop? Do I have enough to cover what I cannot predict? What happens if my health changes? What if I live longer than I planned for? Those questions do not have confident answers for most people, and that uncertainty makes the decision to retire genuinely difficult. The result is that retirement becomes something many people move in and out of, rather than step fully into. Someone retires, takes a break, and returns to part-time or contract work within months. Not because they miss working, but because complete financial disengagement feels uncomfortable. A gradual reduction in hours rather than a clean stop. Temporary roles, consulting work, reduced responsibility rather than full exit. Retirement stops being a destination and becomes a long, ambiguous transition. Part 7. Social Security, the foundation that feels less certain. Underneath all of this is one system that a significant portion of Americans still rely on as the primary structure of their retirement income: Social Security. For many retirees, it is not a supplement to other savings. It is the foundation. Without it, estimates suggest that poverty rates among Americans over 65 would increase dramatically, affecting tens of millions of people who currently depend on it to meet basic living expenses. In that sense, the system is doing what it was designed to do. It is functioning. But the concern is not really about what it does today. According to projections from the Social Security Administration, the main trust fund is expected to face significant funding pressure within the next decade, based on current trajectories, by the early 2030s. Incoming payroll tax revenue may only be sufficient to cover approximately 77% of scheduled benefits if no policy adjustments are made before that point. The system does not disappear in that scenario. But benefits would need to be reduced, or the funding structure would need to change, or some combination of both. That projection introduces something important into a part of the system that people had always treated as predictable. Social Security was never designed to be a full replacement for income. It was designed to work alongside personal savings and other retirement assets. The expectation was that people would combine these sources. The problem, as discussed throughout this video, is that for a large number of people, those other sources are not strong enough. When confidence in Social Security starts to waver even slightly, it affects the stability of the entire structure that people are trying to build retirement around. That uncertainty ripples outward in specific ways. People who might have retired begin delaying the decision. Younger workers look at the projections and question whether the system will exist in the same form when they need it. Some disengage from long-term planning entirely, reasoning that if the foundation is uncertain, building on top of it feels pointless. None of those responses improve the situation, but they are predictable reactions to genuine uncertainty in a system that was supposed to be reliable. Conclusion: when you step back and look at the full picture, a pattern emerges. People are not confused about what they are supposed to do: work, save, invest, and eventually step away. The sequence is well understood. The problem is that each part of that sequence has become harder to execute reliably than it used to be. Savings are not where they need to be for a large portion of the population, not because of poor decisions, but because the margin required to save consistently has been squeezed from multiple directions simultaneously. The cost of living has moved faster than income in enough categories that long-term planning requires a stability most households do not have. Healthcare introduces a category of risk that cannot be fully anticipated. And the systems designed to support people in retirement still function but feel less predictable than they did in previous generations. What defines the current retirement situation in America is not one large, obvious failure. It is several smaller gaps operating simultaneously and reinforcing each other. Individually, each might be manageable. Together, they create a situation that feels overwhelming and changes behavior in ways that often make the underlying problem worse. The real question is not whether retirement is possible. For some people, it still is. The question is whether the version most Americans were working towards, stable, secure, and financially independent, still exists in the same form. Increasingly, people are answering that question for themselves, and the answers suggest they are no longer confident that it does.